is Gavin Newsom's bizarre new social media strategy where he's mimicking Donald Trump and going pretty hard in the paint actually paying off for him. Well, Harry Enton of CNN has some numbers he thinks suggest actually show it is working for California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom. Before we get to that, make sure you subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Without further ado, though, let's take a look at CNN polling guru, data guru, Harry Enton.
Yeah, I think it absolutely has been working in terms of generating attention, which is what he's trying to do, right? I mean, take a look here. Let's take a look right at the @GovPress office followers on X. That's, of course, where you get those sort of the account where Newsom posts those Trump-style mocking types of tweets. Get this. That account, get this, up 450% in terms of the number of followers since mid-June. And it's not just on Twitter, X, where Newsom is gaining. Even on TikTok and Instagram, his followers are up over 1 million since January alone. In politics, especially if you're thinking of entering in 2028, it's all about generating attention. And so far, Gavin Newsom has done a good job at generating attention.
Now, this is a very interesting analysis from Enton because Gavin Newsom has two jobs right now. He is working on two different levels. His first job, hopefully his top job for the sake of the people of California, his top priority, is being the governor of California, one of the largest economies in the world, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. But his second job, very clearly, is gearing up to run for the candidacy, the Democratic presidential nomination as a candidate in 2028. So he's doing two things at once here. Obviously, in his capacity as governor, he is tackling this redistricting question, but he's doing it, and this is not new to any politician, he's doing his official job in a way that he thinks is going to boost his odds for the next job that he wants to have. And that's why the strategy, I even ran this past, by the way, a Republican strategist. And that person said basically what Harry Enton said. If you are planning to run for president, it doesn't even, like, he's a deep blue state governor, right? He doesn't need to get reelected in a swing state. He's a deep blue state governor. He's not causing big problems for other California Democrats if he starts amping up his name recognition or amping up his messaging on the national stage, and then also bringing in potentially more fundraising money as you do that. So it's not like he's trying to appeal to a broad swath of the country at this point. He wants his next job to be winning a Democratic primary, and he is governing a pretty blue state. So at the same time, there's kind of a synergy in those two jobs. So that's where, for Gavin Newsom, it's actually almost easier than if you're an Andy Bashir or a Gretchen Whitmer. Those two, if they end up running, would obviously try to make the case to primary voters, as Biden did fairly successfully in 2020, that he's just more electable in a general election. Electability is an important factor that people think about in primary elections, and Gavin Newsom potentially, beclowning himself with weird Trump mimicry, does that make it harder for him to get elected in a general? You know what? At this point, it doesn't actually matter because he has an entire primary cycle to reshape the narrative about him. And so if he's able to just completely increase his name recognition nationally and create goodwill with Democrats, not the entire country, but with Democratic primary voters, with the Democratic grassroots, it actually doesn't necessarily matter right now if he is pissing off Republicans, conservatives, and maybe even some independents who, come primary time, are basically coming into it with, fairly hazy memories. Not everybody is super politically active every single day consuming this news and is watching debates is listening to town halls, is seeing what's coming out of New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, and making up their mind at that point when you see Newsom juxtaposed with a stable of other candidates. So you have a lot of opportunity to reshape the narrative about yourself. And there's an argument that the cost-benefit analysis for Gavin Newsom is very clearly on the side of the costs of looking unserious with this Trump mimicry outweigh the costs are not outweighed by the benefits of creating a lot of goodwill with Democrats, boosting your name recognition, and emerging as potentially the leader of the Trump 2.0 resistance. So I think that's what Gavin Newsom is doing, and that's one of the things, as like someone who's deeply skeptical of Gavin Newsom's national political future, I actually think Harry Enton is making a very good point. Now, why am I deeply skeptical of Gavin Newsom's national political future? Well, because I think in a low institutional trust environment, Gavin Newsom is someone who comes across as an old school sort of slimy, swampy political character, just like in the most basic sense. I think he's got villain energy. Not that that's necessarily a non-starter in politics, but I think in a low institutional environment, that makes it, in a way, harder. He comes across with this sort of faux authenticity that, Mitt Romney definitely had back in 2012. It's typical of politicians. I always think of Romney as someone who's a multimillionaire kind of rolling up his sleeves at the Iowa State Fair and talking about how much he loves corn dogs or whatever it is. And everybody knows that it's an act. Maybe he really loves corn dogs, but everyone knows that this "I'm just like you" shtick while you have a car elevator, in Mitt Romney's case, is an act. So I think Newsom falls into that category, or has long fell into that category. And I always think about it. I've said this before on the show. There's two steps to being a good politician, and he has step one down. He is an effective weather vane. If you're buying a weather vane at Home Depot, you'd want to buy Gavin Newsom. He's very good at finding where the wind is blowing and following it. He did that as wokeness, or whatever you want to call it, was gaining traction on the left. And now he's doing it again as anti-wokeness is gaining traction on the center left. And even, the left has sort of tried to move on in different ways. But what he can't do then is execute on populist policies. He might learn that he should talk a more populist game, that Democrats want to see their politicians, lawmakers, candidates punching the right in the nose. We talked about that with a Texas Democrat who we had on the show last week, and we talked about it again on Monday when we replayed that video of Representative Ana Maria Rodriguez Ramos from Texas, who was talking to us about how this is just like the Democrats' Tea Party movement. This is their version of the Tea Party moment. They detest the Democratic establishment just as much as Republicans detested the Republican Party establishment. And it took Donald Trump winning a primary for the Republican establishment to recognize that. And it will take maybe something else dramatic happening to Democrats for them to recognize it. I don't know if it'll quite be, Gavin Newsom tweeting in this Trump fashion. Although I will say, I think the posts have gone from the Alec Baldwin Trump impression to the Shane Gillis Trump impression, which is this, to say, a kind of dark, clumsy impression that doesn't really resemble Trump so much as it resembles the left, like the hard left's version of Trump, whereas most of the country is able to, even if they hate Donald Trump, laugh at Donald Trump. And Shane Gillis had a more, like, you can't fully, if you don't understand Trump, you can't fully do an impression of Trump because you're sort of blocked. You hit that brick wall of deep hatred. But the Shane Gillis impression is much better and much funnier because, and by the way, I think that's a fairly objective analysis. I think the public has responded to Shane Gillis in a way that suggests that's a fairly objective analysis because he just understands. And actually, even the guy who does Trump on SNL now, he understands Trump in a way that Baldwin never could. I mean, again, he just hit that brick wall of hatred that stopped him from fully capturing Donald Trump. And I actually feel, this is way too in the weeds, but I actually feel like Gavin Newsom has, over the course of the week, gone from what I saw as extremely cringy attempts to mimic Trump in a way that was maybe funny to like the Nicole Wallace viewer, who's not even a super significant factor in the, maybe like your affluent resistance hanger on from 2017, who's not even a major player in the Democratic primary, to being like genuinely funny. For example, this Cracker Barrel post, and believe me, there's no part of me that wants to find Gavin Newsom funny, and I don't think Gavin Newsom wrote this social media post. But this is from the Governor Newsom press office. All caps. What is wrong with Cracker Barrel? Keep your beautiful logo. The new one looks like cheap Velveeta, quote, cheese from Walmart, the place for, quote, groceries, parentheses, an old-fashioned term, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. That is, I think, genuinely funny because it's come to actually resemble Trump's style, and it's particularly, I think, funny because it has an interesting critique of Trump buried into it, and we don't need to go too deep in the weeds on this, but it's an interesting critique of Trump as the president of the United States devoting his time to talking about things like Cracker Barrel or whatever else in a way that that was genuinely unprecedented for Donald Trump to spend so much time talking about just very particular, specific things, largely outside of government life, when we're talking about these examples. And that's, I think, one of the reasons this is funny, and also because it does capture Trump's style in a way that I don't think the earlier posts fully understand. But let's just put that aside. With Newsom, he is now doing step one. He understands that a way to level with voters in a low institutional trust environment is to look really aggressive, because Democrats want to see that. Democrats do not trust the establishment, and so if you can look like you can start to violate the norms that the Democratic establishment has held so dear and so precious for so long, it does make it look like you're fighting, like you're someone who is willing to violate those norms, like you're someone who is willing to come in and really fight in a way that average voters who are not represented among the lobbying class and the consultant class in Washington, D.C., or in Sacramento, for that matter, by the way, average voters just want to see it. We can talk about whether or not that's good or bad for our politics, but it is true that is what a lot of the grassroots on the left and the right want to see and have wanted to see for a long time. And Democrats have held themselves back from understanding this and successfully capitalizing on it, because it's one of the rare occasions when their advantage with the media has been something that actually held them back, right? Because take, for example, when Joe Rogan and Bernie Sanders were going to sit down and the left freaked out, had this moment of canceling Joe Rogan because he's perpetuating a system of bigotry and he is racist and all of these other sexist, transphobic, all these other allegations that were hurled at Joe Rogan, who was very sympathetic to Democrats, very sympathetic especially to the populist left, and in ways a more natural fit with the populist left than the populist MAGA right, but was kind of pushed into the arms of the populist MAGA right by cancel culture. So because of that, Democrats took Joe Rogan for granted. Who had them on to talk about how evil Joe Rogan was? The media, everywhere. The quote, mainstream media, the establishment media. Democrats were all over the place getting a sympathetic ear, and basically their narrative peddled through the media at the time, the establishment media, the corporate media at the time. And so they didn't realize how out of step that was with Democrats who were listening to Joe Rogan, or maybe didn't even have anything against Joe Rogan around the country. And they took that massive platform of normal people for granted and swore it off. And that's where this class of Democratic politicians, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg is another good example. That's where this class of Democratic politicians is ill-equipped for a moment of such low institutional trust. We're at a record low, tied for a record low in trust in mass media, according to Gallup statistics, because they for so long took new media for granted in a way the right couldn't. The right didn't have a sympathetic ear in the establishment press. So they had to, they really had no choice but to either create their new outlets or go on other new outlets. Even, for example, Rogan, who is not by any means like a traditional conservative, but the right, the J.D. Vances, were more open to doing it and thus have that skill already baked into their political personas in a way that the left does not. And Gavin Newsom, I think right now, he was talking to a bunch of influencers like Harry Sisson and Olivia Juliana, who are themselves kind of trying to learn how to seem authentic and to be authentic. Like that Harry Sisson sit down with Adam Friedland, where he just couldn't laugh at Friedland's politically incorrect jokes, I think is another really good example of that. Gavin Newsom, maybe one of the better examples is him talking to Charlie Kirk about how Democrats got trans kids, the policy issue around trans kids, incorrect, but then has maintained the same policies in his state that reflect that. So you have step one, recognizing that you should say it and you should talk like that. You should say the thing and talk like it, but can he actually do the thing in practice? Or is he still too deeply tied to the lobbying groups that sort of initially pushed those policies to be someone who creates friction in that space? Really good question. Really good question going forward, because it speaks to how far Gavin Newsom will actually be able to take these tweets. The podcast hasn't really taken off in a way that has made Gavin Newsom like the left's Joe Rogan, but it's so meta the way that he's communicating, because he's mocking Trump on the one hand, like he's mimicking Trump for the sake of mockery. On the other hand, though, he's also violating norms that Trump violated and conceding that point to Trump, right? That it's okay as a politician to sort of be engaged in this combat, this like very bitter and, superficially at least, unserious combat. Now, he's making a serious point with it, or he's trying to make a serious point with it, but that is a very meta critique. And again, I don't want to go too deep in the weeds and treat this as something that's more serious than it is, but we don't often think about, it's so easy to just, social media just rolls on, right? It feels like we're all living an infinite scroll. Like every day is just, you wake up and you're back into the infinite scroll stream, and we don't always pause to think about what this stuff means. And just pausing to think about what this means, Gavin Newsom is trying to pioneer something different for the left in a low institutional trust, new media environment. And I think it is working to the extent that he's trying to position himself for president in 2028. I'm not saying right now, I think it's way too early to tell whether it's working beyond Democratic primary voters. But if it's working with Democratic primary voters, he's at least coming up with part one there. And then whether he's able to become like a nationally palatable figure, I think the jury is still wildly out on that question, because Donald Trump is singular. He is Donald Trump for whatever reason. I think probably because the alternatives to him have consistently been establishment figures that are unpalatable to a wide swath of the country. He's able to capture like an equal portion or an almost equal portion to his Democratic opponents when he's put to the test nationally. Newsom, if he tries to do this sort of unserious, jokey thing in a general election, which I don't know he necessarily would, and I don't know that this indicates that he would, but whether that, he can get away with violating norms, that's for sure. With average voters, that's that cat is out of the bag, toothpaste is out of the tube. But one thing that I'm less certain of is that voters will be tolerant of somebody who's kind of smarmy and jokey. Because I don't know if, I think politicians should probably take themselves less seriously. I think that's good in a low institutional trust environment. But again, Trump is singular. He's gotten away with things because, in part, he's had awful opponents, and because it's just, There's nobody else like him, love him or hate him. So if Newsom's able to continue this, I think is an open question. If he's able to continue this, he's clearly not writing these posts. I'm sure he's laughing at them, but he's not writing them. If he's able to come across like this on his own when he's talking, that's another question too. And we will see. We'll be following all of it here. So please stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv. We'll be back with more soon.